This is the Gauntlet podcast. My name is Jason, and I am joined by my co-host, Lowell. Hi, Lowell.
Hey, Jason. How you doing?
Pretty good, thanks. This is our monthly Gauntlet Hangouts Round-up episode, and for this month, we are happy to welcome back Fraser Simons. Hey, Fraser.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good, pretty good. So let's talk about games we have played in July. I actually am not going to talk too much about what I did because everything I played was either my game The Between, which we talked about last month quite a bit, or something that I played in preparation for Fear of a Black Dragon, which I will be talking about on Fear of a Black Dragon. But I'll run through it. I did get a chance to run 3 different playtest groups of The Between, 2 more short series playtest groups, and then I have started the long playtest, which is going to go for about 12 to 15 sessions, I believe, and Fraser's actually in that group. It's going great. I'm very happy with the player side materials. I'm making a lot of changes, but the playtests are being very, very productive. Like, the things that I intuited might be a problem in the early playtests are being confirmed in the later playtests, and so I know I need to make changes. The process is going really, really well as far as all that goes. So that's something I did. I also ran World of Dungeons using the module Fuck for Satan, which is quite possibly the best named module ever.
Is it better than vaginas or magic?
I think it is, because I personally am not into vaginas, so I don't know if they're magic. But Fuck for Satan is great. I have Fuck for Satan, however, so I definitely like identify more with that one, right? No, it's great. I have to say, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but I will say this. The 2 sessions, we're doing 3 sessions, and I haven't played the third one yet, but the 2 sessions I've done so far, particularly the second session, that's been like one of the most fun sessions I've ever played. Like, it was so freaking fun. I might make the videos available. I'm on the fence about it because it's really gross, but boy, it was enjoyable. So I might do it. I don't know. I'll talk to the players and figure it out.
You could do a Gauntlet After Dark channel.
Very precisely. It's very after dark. Yeah. The other thing I did this month, I got a chance to run Velvet Glove, finally. That's going pretty well so far. I'm not quite ready to talk about it yet, and so I'm holding off on Velvet Glove. I'm still, I've got 2 more sessions to do, and I'm still kind of like, I don't know, kind of figuring out how I feel about it, because I'm using the Ashcan version, which is already out of date, and so I'm not sure if my thoughts would be like particularly helpful at this point or really insightful, but I'm enjoying it. And I have to say, we had a scene in the last session, and Fraser's in that game as well. We had a scene in the last session where the scene basically took place like at a sort of meeting of our version of the Black Panthers, a sort of like radical African-American like rights group. They're called the Copperheads in our setting. And one of the player characters is, you play, in Velvet Glove, you play a gang of girls in the 70s, right? Like a girl gang. And one of our player characters is this very educated, very like Angela Davis, like young woman. But she's currently involved in like this sort of petty crime. And a good part of this session was about her being like drawn into this more serious, like militant activism. And man, those scenes were so good. Like it was a style of play that I have never really done. Like, I'm personally very familiar with a lot of like kind of like activist type stuff. I have had a lot of activism in my background, right? But I've never really incorporated like real world activism into my role play, and it just felt really good. Like, the scenes were they were just enjoyable. Like, they had like an authentic feel. I was really into it. And let me see, what else did I play this month? I think that might be it for me. But yeah, so I'll talk about some of the stuff that I did. And I played Gardens of Yin. That's the other thing too. Sorry. I played the Gardens of Yin. That was a game that I played in. I was not the GM. That is it's an OSR setting that is it's got some like Alice in Wonderland influences to it. Very, very interesting. Horst ran that one. We'll be talking about that on Fear of a Black Dragon.
Oh, okay.
But enough from me. Let's go to Lowell. Lowell, how was your July?
So, had a lot of games, as usual. Off Gauntlet, we did our Assassins of the Golden Age face-to-face. We're well deep in our Blades in the Dark campaign. I started Hearts of Wulin for the home group, and also I've been doing the Veil with a couple of people who haven't played PBTA before, and it's been really interesting to see them embrace it. And one of the players there is a young man who's like a marine biology student, and he's home from Hawaii, and he's, I think, just kind of coming to terms with his sexuality as being gay. And he loved the aesthete or the aesthetic, the sort of artist character. And he sort of has blended all of that stuff together with his character. And it's been just a pleasure to watch him play. Whereas usually he's kind of a Pathfinder character player. So that's been fun. And then on Gauntlet, finished out Blades in the Dark. I did Masks, Worldwide Wrestling, and Dungeon World. So very much a PBTA month. It was a good month, though this is one of those months where I had a couple of different sort of player problems and problems from my side that kind of complicated a couple of the sessions where I wasn't, where I didn't walk away as happy as I usually do. So that's one of those things I kind of struggle with from time to time where I hit a player who isn't like doing things that I expect, or in the case, I'll name a name here for Worldwide Wrestling. Patrick chose a really challenging playbook, and I didn't do a great job of giving him support in that challenging choice. And so he didn't have as good a time as he could have. It was one of those cases where he was doing a manager. It's one of those areas that I don't know a lot about. He doesn't know a lot about. And I think as a result, it was a suboptimal play experience for him.
No, that's too bad. I mean, I assume you guys talked about all of this, right?
Yeah. That's why I wanted to mention it, because I think that is one of the things that is nice about the Gauntlet is Patrick came to me and we talked about it between sessions. And then he came to me and sent me a thing and said, hey, here's where I am. I'm not going to do this next session. Here's why. And we talked back and forth about it. And I'm glad that we're in a game space where people can do that and we can have that conversation without people getting defensive or the GM side getting defensive about it. And that's having come out of a world of social fallacies and people getting upset about crap at the table, it's really nice to have people just talking about problems.
That's awesome. I mean, obviously, like, it's not great that you guys had a suboptimal experience, but it's awesome you were able to kind of work through it, at least come to some kind of understanding about it.
Yeah, I've played with Patrick a lot, and I will double down and make his next experience even better. So. But what I wanted to talk about is actually, despite this not being Discern Realities, I wanted to talk about Dungeon World.
Well, Discern Realities is going away, so...
So this is the overlap.
We'll do Dungeon World talk back on the Gauntlet podcast again, so...
So what I ran was the Green Law of Varkith, and this is one of the 3 Chaos Worlds that Brendan Conway did for Magpie, and it's the one that actually drew me into back the Kickstarter, and Varkith is a city of guilds. Everybody has to belong to a guild. There's this magical green lady who set everything up and essentially to fight against the forces of individualist, destructive heroes, made it so if you're in Varkith, you have to belong to a group. You have to have a charter. You have to have rules. You have to belong together.
World of guilds.
Yeah, and there's various magics that enforce that. And I think it's a great concept. It means that the structure of this game actually revolves around the guilds rather than kind of exploring or adventuring. And it's a little bit like Blades in that we have a kind of a crew, but it's very, very light in comparison to Blades and how it handles that. And this is the first time I've run Dungeon World ever. So this is...
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I hadn't done it. I've played it, but I hadn't run it. So... I'll talk about why I'm not sure I've run Dungeon World yet at the end.
Okay, fair enough.
So I love the guilds. I love what Brendan has done in the book with that, how it shapes what you're going to play. We don't have conventional fronts and goals. Instead, the players at the start can choose whatever they want to be. They could be bakers. They could be wedding planners. They could be criminals. They could be musicians. They set that, and then we play out what it takes to do that. And obviously there are certain things you're going to gravitate towards, being sellswords or guards or things like that. And of course, our group are magical artifact collectors for the Twilight Museum. But it's very open. The book is nice about not limiting us in that. So we've got these guilds, and the guilds actually have a little bit of a character sheet. They have a set of moves, they have some stats, and we've got NPC guilds that are out there that have their own sets of stats. And every once in a while, we do a guild turn. And in a guild turn, each guild chooses an action, and there's a set of those, and each of those has moves like collect information or violently attack, or infiltrate, those kinds of moves. And the book has you actually walk through the NPC guilds down to the PC guilds. You do it in order of size and kind of reveal what happens. And that then rolls into the fiction. And the book has a big set of charts on what happens when two NPC guilds go against one another versus what the PC guilds do. So it sounds like a lot, but it's actually not all that much. What it does is it creates all kinds of things that are going on in the background for the next several sessions. So as it happened, I did all that randomly at the start to kind of generate who was doing what to whom and what they were doing. And then we figured out why. And then the players were able to go, okay, well, I know that this guild is going against them. Let's go find out what's happening. Why are they doing that? Or let's go talk to our friend who's in that guild. It generated a lot of content. And unlike Blades, this is a kind of thing that you're doing maybe every, I would guess, 3 to 5 sessions.
Oh, okay.
So it's infrequent. It kind of resets the meter. You get to stop and go, okay, here's some things that have happened. Here's some things going forward. And I think it's really sharp. Varkith is very much drawing from Planescape and from Sigil, obviously, and I love Planescape.
Oh, okay. All right. I was wondering what the touchstones were there. Okay.
I would say that and Perdido Street Station by China Mieville.
Mieville, or I don't know how to say it.
And it is an urban setting. It's got those groups. And I love urban fantasy. I love classical urban fantasy. I've run city adventures for years. I ran RuneQuest and Glorantha in Pavis for years. I ran a City Guards game for a couple of years. I really, really love it. This is particularly well done. One of the things that Conway does is you have a little bit of sort of, here's the background history. It's just a couple of pages. But then all of the sort of the backstory of the world gets told from the different peoples that are there. There are 10 different fantasy peoples. I would call them races in another game. They're very distinct. They each offer a different sort of slice of history and different, very strange cultures. And they're pretty crazy. We've got the Vislika. They're kind of an aquatic set of undersea dwellers that just kind of float up to the surface, and they believe that the elder gods are coming to eat everybody, and that's a good thing. You've got the freed ones. These are magical familiars that have rebelled against their mages and have formed their own society here. There's the Cricktree, which are intelligent ant colonies that are attached to a sort of skeletal magical frame. And there are others that are just as crazy. It's a really, really interesting set of choices. Unlike Dungeon World.
I was about to say, it doesn't really sound like Dungeon World so far. Yeah.
Yeah, it's very different from standard Dungeon World in that the book says you don't have to have fronts. The players' choices with the guilds will generate what you need. The guilds themselves and their opposition and their relationships will form that. Like this last session, we had roll out in the guild turn from a move that one of the other guilds was attacking the group. And we could have done that kind of as a resist roll, but we ended up rolling that into the first half of the session. Essentially where they were when they got attacked, how they got ambushed, and then them racing back to fight the people who were trying to break into their guild house. And it was stuff that I just love. I love that kind of running around and chaos and people getting a chance to describe all the weird stuff of the city, like the parade of honey and things like that. And there is some city details, some bits in there that Brendan has put in that I kind of forget to get to. They're wonderful, but we've got so much generated by the players. I don't need to pull that stuff in.
I'm a big fan of Lankmar-ish urban adventure, right? Like running across rooftops and breaking into safes and deep places and things like that. This is super interesting because it sounds like that, but like the fantasy kind of like really elevated here.
Yeah. Here is the thing that I think for me sets a fantasy game set in the city apart from anything else is if your group is operating a city, you can't burn things down. Essentially, you can't shit where you sleep. You are living there. You have to take that into account.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And I think that that's really important that you have to maintain relationships. You have to keep that going. And that's what I love about a good fantasy city game. He does have some fronts in the book. They're very interesting. Each one is tied to one of the races, and they're a really good set of ideas for things to throw in. I don't think you need to use them, but you could, and they're a good thing to mine for what you want to do at the table. So my bottom line is I think Green Law of Varkith is great. There are some things that I'm still kind of working through, that I'm still figuring out. In the book, Conway is very much, you have to run it this way. You have to do these guild turns. You have to do all the NPCs. You have to do this. You have to do X, Y, and Z. And when I was reading that really turned me off, because I don't like that very, very prescriptive, you must do these things tone. But once I got to the table, I could see why he had us doing it and how easy it was. It was actually easier than I think he presented it in the book. And because there are parts and pieces that lean on each other, I see why he had it do it. It was just one of those things that when I was first reading it, I didn't like. But at the table, I got over that quickly. There is some fuzziness at the table about how you present those guild turns. Like, how much are we, okay, let's walk through the roles, or how much are we kind of giving information and how that gets interplayed. I think the GM will have to really look at that and decide which way they want to do it. I had a little table with here's the guilds on one side and then across the top, and this person's doing this to them. And we walked through and revealed things. And so we really kind of stepped out to that meta level for that. And I think that worked for our group. Another thing is that in some of the other of the Chaos Worlds, he has a little more stuff about, changed up playbooks and add-ons and things. He doesn't so much in Varkith. And I'm not sure that the standard playbooks and their conceptual frame as Dungeon World characters, whether that actually fits. Some of them, I think, could use some tweaking.
That kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, because the Dungeon World playbooks are tropey as fuck, right? I mean, they are it is a very particular type of fantasy adventure thing that the Dungeon World playbooks assume.
Mm-hmm.
And so I could see how, if you have a setting where you have apparently ant people and, and deep ones or whatever, maybe the druid's ability to change into a raccoon isn't as interesting, right?
Yeah. And some of the abilities, particularly the thief, I would like some more things that kind of fit with what an urban thief does, because they aren't as much in there.
That makes sense too. Yeah, I could see that.
And so if I were going to do this again, I would go back and I would look at those moves, and I would look at what other people have done. I did allow the Templar and the Artificer because I really like those playbooks.
Mm.
And they seem to work pretty well, though I might even want to tweak those. But yeah, I think that is something you want to be aware of if you're going to run Varkith, is that the playbooks may not entirely sync up with what the world is doing. So you may want to spend some time tweaking those. Another thing is that I know of Perdido Street Station and I know of Miaville's work. I'm familiar with what it does, but I'm really more of a Planescape person. And I'd say the tone actually leans a little bit more towards Perdido. And he's got all these strange peoples, 10 of them. They're all the people. There are no elves, there are no sort of classic dwarves, things like that. So we've got a lot of out there stuff, but the absence of the classical races and things, I think, doesn't give people a thing to hook onto. Like you've got Grok and get these 10 races, because that's all there is. And they're all weird and they all have these things. And so that's cognitive load that's right at the start.
Yeah, that kind of makes sense, because the classic species or races or whatever in fantasy games, like elves and dwarves and halflings and things, they're all just kind of different versions of human, right? Essentially. Yeah. Right. And so I think it's easier to kind of identify with these very kind of simple ideas. Like, we know dwarves are greedy, right? We know that halflings are salt of the earth. We know that elves like to sing songs about trees, right? Like, they're very like simple ideas that have been like, that are really easy to latch onto, so I kind of see that.
Yeah. And I'm kind of torn about that, because one of the things is those races and peoples that they set up are a great thing to hook people who, like Frasier, don't dig fantasy, don't dig classical fantasy, because they are so weird and wild and gritty and strange. I think it would be a good thing to run for people, if you want to run fantasy, for people who don't ordinarily dig fantasy. I think it'd be a good thing for that.
I think the tricky thing there is it can get a little too, what I like to call, and indeed have called in the past, like, it can get a little too ornate, right? Mm-hmm. So the classic example of this problem for me is, what's that Monty Cook game that's really big? I can't think of the name of it right now. Numenera. Yeah. So to me, Numenera is wildly interesting. Like, the book is super interesting. It's got so many wild, crazy, strange things like going on in this world. But gosh, it is a lot to ask everybody at the table to get into the same headcanon, right? Like, it's a lot to sort of, the cognitive load is huge, right? And so I mean, that can be a problem, right? Like, it can actually affect role play when the setting is so ornate that, like, you have a difficult time like making it mean anything,
Yeah, and I think Numenera is a great example of that, because Numenera has a great concept, has a great hook at the start, but then everything else is overwritten. It's just so much stuff to get through.
Right, yeah. Varkith, 10 races, that's not like as bad.
Right, no.
Like, yeah.
A couple other things. I would have liked to see more like NPC characters in there, that I think, because I love good NPCs. It doesn't have any of the philosophical guilds like the factions from Planescape. I would have maybe liked a little bit more of that. Also, it would have been good if the artist had read the material, because there is some art in here where they have for particular people, and I'm like, that is not at all. They're described as hairless. Look at that mullet on this guy. Maybe he's wearing a wig. I don't know. There are several places where there's a real disconnect between the description in the text and the art that's actually given. But anyway, full stop. I think it's great. I think it's really striking to see how different these three different Chaos worlds are. Despite the wildness of the setting, I think it's a more conventional approach than perhaps Anglekite or Cold Ruins of Last Life. It's definitely my favorite of the three. I think there's a ton you could steal from this. But as I said at the start, I'm not sure it's Dungeon World. There's a lot of Dungeon World tech that I ignored. All of the, moving across, all of the journeying stuff. Also, it is a setting that absolutely shows you that parlay is a bad move. It is.
That's actually really interesting to hear. Yeah.
Well, I've heard you say that before, and I was always like, yeah, whatever. But when we got to the table, it's like, oh man, I hate this move. This is killing me. And so I don't think I've run Dungeon World. I've run the Green Law of Varkith, which is, has a Dungeon World core to it.
Yeah, David loves the other one, Cold Ruins of Last Life. He's been chomping at the bit to talk about it on DR, but we haven't done a regular DR episode in 100 years, so we will be at some point, I'm sure. But he really loves it. And he also played Last Days of Anglekite also, and he loved that one as well. I haven't read them. I have them all, and I haven't read them or played them, or I haven't read them closely or played them. I think my issue with the Chaos Worlds, and it really just comes down to personal preference for me. I don't like for my fantasy adventure gaming to be that big,
Mm-hmm.
Like Last Days of Anglekite is so big in scope, right? Like it's like, like huge
right.
deity things going on, right? And Cold Ruins of Last Life is this very like dark, grim, like extreme kind of like Dark Soulsy like universe, right? I don't play that big in Dungeon World, right? Like I play I can get 5 sessions. I can get 5 good solid sessions with just like in a village, right? Like in a village with like some creepy mystery, right? Like that's my style of fantasy party based adventure gaming. And so that's mainly why I haven't grabbed onto those.
Yeah. And I get that, but I have to say, very much the big fantasy is my jam. I love that stuff. And that being said, Anglekite is actually a little too much for me.
It's when David was describing it, I was like, man, it sounds it sounds really epic. I mean, it sounds really epic, but and he loves it. Like he's really into that, right? And I think it just comes down to personal preference. Some people are just into that really big, epic Wagnerian sort of fantasy, right?
Yeah, but I think Varkith doesn't fall into that trap. I think it's really awesome. I think the tools that it gives, you could steal for a lot of other stuff. Like if you're like, oh, I kind of like the idea of Blades in the Dark and the crew stuff and things, but I don't want to have to go through all this stuff. Go look at Varkith. There's some great stripped down tools that you could use to do any kind of urban game that has different groups conflicting.
Awesome. Fraser, how was your July?
My July was great. I played a game that Lowell was wanting to play last time. He had it on his list that he was anticipating, I think. Spire, which is it's going quite well. It's run by Darren, who I think is like a new kind of superstar. Maybe not like super new, but he's a superstar in everything that we've played in. Yeah, he's great. And he's the one that's running it. He's doing a very good job of explaining it all. It's a really evocative setting that is interesting. I'm playing like a Vermissian sage that is a weird sort of researcher living in the bowels of the Spire that is like a metro system that is like now derelict and gone and stuff. So there's lots of interesting things going on. He's using a campaign frame, and he is continuing to run it in September, I think, too. So I'm going to try to get into that. I also was in Velvet Glove and Gardens of Yin, which I thought was very good. You can check out my post to the Gauntlet if you want to hear about that, because White Hack just kind of blew my mind a little bit.
Yeah, you did a couple of good write-ups about those Gardens of Yin sessions. They're really good.
Yeah. And I've been playing Veil 2020 Land of the Free, which is a Cyberpunk 2020 module. And I actually started it as a playtest for Veil 2020, which is in Codex 2, Chrome 2. That is in the feed now, so you should go get it and play it because it's good. I've been playtesting it.
It will not be in the feed as of the time this episode comes out.
Oh,
so, yeah. Sorry, listeners. we told you last month about Veil 2020 on the ads, but it'll be a drive through at some point. So yeah, So please do tell us about it.
Yeah. Well, then you can just hear about how amazing it is and have your mouth water. So I designed this game to be able to run old school, which is kind of funny referring to Cyberpunk as old school now, but it is, right? It's as old as if you were buying a classic car now. So that's kind of funny. And I'm running Land of the Free, which is a cross-country cyberpunk mega adventure that's kind of meant to show off the setting that they've generated. And it's been going pretty well. The setting is pretty evocative. It's definitely 90s, is what I will say. But the interesting thing that I find about reading it is that it has some great artwork that is very good at representation, surprisingly. So there's like healthy amount of sexism and a healthy amount of representation in it, which is not something you're typically going to see. But I think also people conflate Land of the Free and other supplements with the main game, Cyberpunk 2020, written by Pondsmith. And I would say that is a misconception. When I recently reread the core manual for Cyberpunk 2020, there's none of that ingrained in it. There's a little bit of the artwork stuff, but you can tell that's just marketing, right? They're like, hey, Cyber Babe with an arm, check it out. But there's no like...
Right, yeah. I mean, you had to... In the 90s, all the women had to have, their tits out, right? I mean, that's just kind of like the way it was, right? I mean, I remember... Lowell, you'll remember this too. The original Riffs core book. You remember that? Oh my God. It's so bad. It's so,
Didn't she have, a dog collar and chain on thing?
No, it's like that sort of, that sort of slave trader creature on a little raft thing, and he's got his 4 blind slave women around him, and they're wearing mesh see-through bodysuits, right? And it's so bad.
Oh yeah.
Anyway.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Well, it's not that bad.
Yeah.
But no, the 90s were the 90s for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. But I see people referring to Cyberpunk 2020, the core game, as something that is somewhat problematic. And I would say that go back, read the core book, because it's not that, whereas some of the other settings written by other people, I think, are the ones that are giving that perception. Because the main game is great. I actually recently read an essay on, like an academic essay on the game that was about the dichotomy of fashion and the humanity cost, which was like a big thing that other people have appropriated as tech. But the major thing that it was saying is the argument that the text is such a verbose use of how to get across your setting and the tone of the game and everything. It emphasizes fashion all of the time and wanting you to buy it. It's almost like you can see in the layout of the game, it's trying to sell you the things. It's like trying to make you a consumer of the very product that you're supposed to hate as a cyberpunk. It's very clever. And then the dichotomy, though, is that as you try to get into this subculture and get cyber limbs and look cooler and wear the mirror shades and stuff, you actually lose some of your empathy and you have to work to get that back. So that's where the humanity cost comes from. It's actually a lot better than I initially had looked at it. Before I was like, humanity cost, this is bad. But when looking at it from that perspective, I actually thought it was quite clever and it works well. So it was kind of neat to dig into that. But Land of the Free is not doing that.
No.
Well, I was about to say, you originally started looking at Cyberpunk 2020 when I asked you to write Veil 2020, right? I mean, that was kind of what kicked that off. I'd be curious just to hear a little bit more about Veil 2020 as a system, because we haven't actually talked about it in depth on the show. Like, when you were doing Veil 2020, I basically, listeners, the way this came about was I just kind of approached Fraser and said, hey, I'd love to do World of Dungeons, but for Cyberpunk. So can we do that? And, like, can we have a version of the Veil that does that, right? Like to the Veil as World of Dungeons is to Dungeon World, right? And so I'd be curious, Fraser, like, when you agreed, obviously, when you started doing that research and trying to figure out like what was necessary to capture about Cyberpunk 2020, the game, what did you land on? Like, what did you feel like were the important things there?
Yeah, so if you read the game, something that is not present in the Veil, but is present in Veil 2020 is all the cyberware. And I specifically added in all the fashionware because of that thing the piece that I read on it and how important it is and intrinsic to the game. And I also wanted to make it just like more punk, because first wave cyberpunk is more ingrained in the punk movement than later stuff. So I have all of the cyberware. The only thing you can't get is people that are super into hardwired. I couldn't fit the chipset stuff because that would have been like, that would have been a lot of words. But all the other cyberware, all the other fashion wear, if you want your cool tattoos, if you want your subculture aesthetic, it's all there. You can pay for it with your Euro dollars, which I also brought into the game. I also brought in the classes, which is directly inspired by White Hack. I had recently read that as well, just to get into like a kind of what else are people doing with old school stuff that I could try to appropriate or mix up and stuff. So I did change it a bit, but it is definitely inspired by White Hack with how you make your classes. There's 3 different subgroups. They function in different ways. You get class slots, you spend them to do like quote unquote your thing in the game, right?
That's my absolute favorite part of Veil 2020. The fact that, so it's a pretty slim game, right? Like if you were writing Wodu Cyberpunk, right? And what I love is that sort of like little White Hack way of constructing a character that you kind of like remixed in a little bit. You basically have just 3 classes, but there's a lot of space within those 3 classes to do all the different classes, right? Like all the sorts of things you might imagine would be available to you in Cyberpunk 2020, you kind of have like really boiled it down, and you have a neat little sort of framework for creating characters. I think it's pretty dope.
Yeah, thanks. And I also made it sort of like slyly that if people wanted to run Shadowrun stuff, they could too, right? Like there's nothing stopping you saying you're a street samurai instead of a nomad with a bike or whatever. You could totally take Veil 2020 and run some Shadowrun stuff. It just doesn't have, elves and magic and stuff like that. Yeah, other than that,
so it's not real cyberpunk is what you're saying.
I don't know about that. There's magic in Neuromancer, which is a thing that people tend to forget, which is, I think, kind of funny. People are like, oh, magic, there's no magic in Cyberpunk. I'm like, did you read the book that it was, like, categorized and created the subgenre? Because that has magic in it. But, I definitely don't like Shadowrun, to be honest. Curveball.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a curveball, dude. I think we saw that one coming.
That
was not a Shyamalan twist there.
Yeah. I'm as devious as Weary the Thief was, landing all my misses in the game. But I think one day I bet you that if somebody who liked Shadowrun ran it for me, then I might like it. Because just like I despised D&D until Jason ran a whole bunch of Dungeon World for me. And eventually now I just can't say that I dislike it since I have White Hack and I'm running around in the Gardens of Eden and stuff, right? So clearly it was more about how it was presented and how it was played than the actual material. I just conflated that experience with the entire genre. It was like, fuck that.
I would play Shadowrun every week if it was always like that YouTube video of the 1990 promotional thing with the Shadowrun. If it was always like that, I'd always play. So,
well, I mean, Veil 2020 is out of that.
Speaking as the person who's most recently run Shadowrun of the three of us,
yeah,
having run Shadowrun Anarchy last year, no, it's not that.
Yeah, it could be though.
Could be.
Hold on to your hope. But the system has the Veil core die mechanic, though, so you're using your emotions to roll and figure out what the fiction's coming from. I really liked how I've deliberately framed the rolls as a stakes question, though, so you can scale it with, one guy taking out 10 people as like a nomad or a street samurai or whatever, or something a lot more granular. It scales well with more players. And that's actually worked very well. Lately I have 6 players in a group instead of the 4 I think I started out with. And it scaled very well just because I've actually been getting a whole bunch of players to do a whole bunch of other stuff instead of the typical, like, well, I help them, and then they get to roll advantage, right? I'm like, you've got your own problems, right? You're going to get shot, or you're going to help them? What do you want to do? You want to go home? You want to go to jail, right? And that's been working quite well. And I've actually quite enjoyed the material of Land of the Free. The adventure is pretty cool, especially as somebody who hasn't visited the States much. I've been like as far down as Las Vegas in a straight line driving. That's it. So seeing like what the Mississippi has come to, they just struck against a corporation that's dumping all their crap into the Mississippi River. Then they got to New Orleans. They were in Memphis and killed Elvis, who was a deified god there, like a religion. Yeah. So there's a lot of interesting stuff. There's stuff that is peculiarly on point with what has happened with America as well, which we have had to X-card. A lot of Confederate flags, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
And other than that, the central conceit of the story is they are a bunch of people that are good at their game. They get hired by a fixer to take out and extract a person who is like a lab tech. Her father was extracting her. There's all this mystery around it. And the funny point around it is that she's a clone, but since it's written in 1990, they're making it like a huge deal, right? Because it's around the time Dolly the Sheep was happening, right? So they're like, wait for it. These players, they'll never guess what's happening. There's all these things going on in the background. You can just feed them little bits of information. They'll never figure it out. But then in Unit 3, they find out that she's a clone and she's got like a hard drive in her brain extracting the information from like a corporation and stuff. And so it's pretty hilarious. We've been kind of leaning into that full tilt silliness, and it's paying off quite a bit. And then the characters have been really fun because they're trying to like punkify this person, Adriana, instead of getting her to like go back to her dad and this wage slave life and stuff like that.
Cyber eye for the straight guy.
Exactly. Yeah, it totally is too. Like they're getting her to go to like get tattoos. They're getting her to like go and participate in their music and stuff like that because some of them are rocker boys and girls.
Cyberpunk Queer Eye just sounds amazing. Like someone please go write that game. Like that needs to be a thing. Yeah. The only thing that is very striking from the module when you read it is like this guy overly wants everybody to know that Adriana is quite attractive. Like if you're on a plane or something, there's a ninja who's a German guy, which was pretty funny actually. And they're like, oh, well, if you want to get the ninja to talk to the NPC, it's quite plausible because she's actually very attractive. So she would just be getting hit on by this ninja anyway, right? And I'm just like, facepalm. Yeah, I have a great group of players. We're fast forwarding through some parts, especially random tables of events that happen on the road, which feel very like Oregon Trail-y. Yeah, it's good, and I think what I'll run next is Euro Tour, which is a bunch of cyberpunks who are trying to protect a rocker boy who's gotten death threats and like leading them around town in shenanigans as he's like screwing up his life, basically. It's so funny reading these older modules. You know, Tom and I have to do that periodically for Fear of a Black Dragon. I suppose we don't have to, but we choose to. And we did the Ledger Domain episode, which was, I mean, that module, it's just a disaster. And you're just like instantly reminded of where we came from as a hobby. It hasn't really been that long, honestly. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty shocking. Like, but I think you also get a sense of like how far we've come too, because, you know, when I was reading that Ledger Domain module, and we covered this on Fear of a Black Dragon, listeners, you can go listen to the more about it there. But I was just like bowled over by how problematic it was, you know? So I think it's interesting that you and your group were able to kind of cabin off the parts of it that like were kind of gross or whatever and still find like the good, fun stuff. I think that's really, you know, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, right? Like, I think that's a good thing to do.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things about, as I think you've alerted to this, is Pondsmith's original vision and writing and material is really solid. It's what came later from other authors and stuff that piled on a lot of really weird stuff, and even the third-party things. And Cyber Generation, the sort of sequel game, kind of actually explicitly kicks back against that, which I think is interesting as well. And I've mentioned this to you before, the European supplements for Cyberpunk 2020 are legendarily
yes,
tone deaf.
Yes.
To European readers.
Yeah.
Because, of course, Cyberpunk and Shadowrun were huge in Europe, and one of the games that did very well there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've been reading Eurotour and Eurotour Plus or whatever, like the sort of setting for it. Yeah, and yeah, sequel. Wow, it's interesting. It'll be a similar, I think, situation where I'll be like, just remember, the X card is here for us. Yeah, Land of the Free has been interesting too, because you guys know that I haven't come from this, what I will call classic gaming now, because it's old enough to be called that. 15 years plus is a classic car, right? So this is my first time running a module ever, period, too, right, in any system. And so that's been interesting as well to see, like, what the writer thinks, like, just what the play culture is, like Jason was saying, right? Like, they're very concerned with, like, well, what if these people aren't into the adventure? And, like, what if they want to fly somewhere instead of taking this boat? Or what if they want to go with this instead of that? Like, and sometimes if you mention something really interesting, they'll just go for that, but this is what you do then, right?
Yeah, module writers, especially, like, at least the ones we've been covering on Fear, sometimes they're really obsessed with that. Like, the players fucking everything up, right? Like, they're really, really obsessed with it. And Tom and I always find it so amusing because, like, our sort of personal styles of play, like, don't even like consider this to be a problem, right? Like, so it's just kind of funny that like, there's like such a like, oh my God, like what happens if they do this? Oh my God, So yeah, super interesting. Well, so getting back to Veil 2020 for just a second, before we wrap up here, the game was designed, to run old Cyberpunk game modules. Like, did it hold up? Like, has it been working?
Totally, yeah. It's really good in particular for statting out people as well, because Cyberpunk modules they don't really have mooks. They have like a CPS score times the player level or whatever. So for you, it's super easy to generate these people because it'll say a level 3 soul or level 3 nomad or whatever. And the way that I've made experience in it is there's one of two choices as you go down it. So I can make pretty dynamic NPCs that they can't really predict, right? Like I can't say, oh yeah, there's going to be a level 3 person coming or whatever, because they don't know what that means. It could have a person that can do more damage or someone that can take more damage depending on what they've chosen throughout the options. And there's multi-class and stuff too, so I would stat out on the fly these guys that could do that.
Yeah, that's cool. That's pretty awesome. I've been one of your dev editors for a long time now, it seems like, and I think that Veil 2020 is your best work from a design standpoint. I really do. Like, not to take away from the much, much lengthier things you've done with the Veil line and with Hack the Planet, but I think like from a pure design goal standpoint, like Veil 2020 is really impressive, Fraser. Like, we didn't talk about it, but the experience point system is so freaking cool. Like, you basically get experience. It's kind of the classic, like, you get experience for the amount of money you get, but only if you spend that money to like fight the man, basically, right?
Yeah. The XP is money. Basically, you get the normal XP for, subverting the government or doing a mission. But if you get money in service of fighting an institution that perpetuates capitalism, that counts towards your XP as well. So, I thought that was a little fun and clever.
That's sharp.
It's a cool touch. Yeah, I thought it's a cool touch. A lot of cool stuff in there. Awesome. Is there anything else you want to say about Veil 2020 and Land of the Free?
I don't think so.
Awesome. Let's go to the next segment. Okay, we are going to look ahead to August and highlight some of the games that we think look interesting on the Gauntlet Hangouts calendar. Lowell, what looks great to you?
So I want to point out that Rich is doing 1%er for, again, the Swoop Gang game. He did this once. This is for Star Wars Saturday. I think it's really interesting because he's taken a very different game and he's used it for Star Wars. And I think he's doing the Lord's work with all of his Star Wars thing. He has built.
Star Wars Saturday is fucking impressive.
It's just amazing. It's
so impressive. Like, I haven't watched any of the videos yet, but I just see what he's doing, like just by the games that he puts up, like changing Cartel to be about the Hutts, like the 1%er thing. Like, I think he's running Sea of Stars, which is Michael's in development game. Like, just the way he's like taking games and making them Star Wars, I think is pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think it's great. I think he's done an amazing job with that, and I hope we see other people following suit with other thematic things. I love the hacks that we're getting. So I'm just pointing to that because I think it's so cool.
I've been thinking about doing a Game of Thrones thing like that for a long time.
Yeah.
Like taking story games and stuff and kind of repurposing them for like particular types of Game of Thrones stories. Like, I'm thinking, or Song of Ice and Fire, that is. Fraser, what about you?
I am excited for Kyle Thompson's Forge in the Dark mecha action game, All Systems Nominal. And with a lot of people that I've talked to, I'm like on this quest to find the perfect mecha game, which I think all of us in our heads were around the same age. We all experienced Evangelion at the same time, and we're looking for that, which would be like the hardest fucking game to make ever, because most people, like, you can't even make sense of the anime mostly. So to codify that would be a very difficult thing. And Kyle Thompson has his review series of Blades in the Dark up on his YouTube channel, so you should check that out. It's Let's Learn Blades, I think. So if anyone can codify a cool mecha game, I think it's him, and I'm looking forward to that on Saturdays.
Awesome. I'm going to break the rules a little bit. Since I didn't really talk about a game in the first segment, I'm going to break the rules and talk about something I'm running in August. So I am pretty excited about a series I have coming up called Monsterhearts True Beauty. So this is going to be a sort of lightly reskinned Monsterhearts. where instead of playing high school kids, we will be playing young people, mostly young people of color, who are in the ballroom scene in 1980s New York City. Now, I may have to explain what the ballroom scene is. It's still a thing. It's not just in the 1980s, but the 1980s was really like it was captured really beautifully in this documentary called Paris is Burning, which I highly recommend for anybody to go watch. It's very, very good. And the ballroom scene is a sort of like gay subculture. Not just gay, it's a queer subculture, let's say. It's a queer subculture. And in the 1980s, it was really about like, you had they were basically like houses. They were called houses. And these were just collections of young people and like older mentors who they kind of like cared for each other and supported each other and looked out for each other. All usually people of color, almost always from very, very poor backgrounds. And what they would do is on Friday night and Saturday night, they would go to these what are called balls. And they were competitions. And the idea is you would come dressed in drag, or you would come dressed in some kind of fashion. If you were cisgendered, you might, there are a lot of cisgendered women who would like just wear like fashion or couture, usually something they stole, right? And you would just like basically like walk a runway and like do a little like kind of like a little performance among the group, and you would get judged and graded. And so it's kind of this like competition thing. And I think the reason why it's such a captivating setting for me is, and I've always been fascinated by it, but it's this time and place, and particularly in the 1980s, where people of color had all of these like very, the media was saturated with like these symbols of like material excess, right? Like you think Dynasty and rich white people, right? Like, and like sort of 80s, like Wall Street, like, fat cats and all that stuff, right? Like it was this like very, very like decadent materialistic decade, but people of color in the inner cities and of course, and poorer whites didn't have access to that glamour, right? They didn't have access to all of that stuff, right? And so they would put on these balls as like their way of like being glamorous, their way of like capturing a little bit of the culture, right? And I just find it so fascinating. And so I'm going to have, it's going to be Monsterhearts still. They're still going to be monsters, but they are not going to be in a school or a homeroom. We're going to be making our ball house. And so that's the idea behind True Beauty, and I'm really excited for it.
Neat.
All right, let's go to Giving Me Life. Codex Storm, the newest issue of the Gauntlet's RPG zine, is now available in our Patreon feed. Codex Storm is all about fantasy. Here's what you'll find inside. To the Halls of the Stormlord, an epic adventure for macchiato monsters inspired by Norse myth. The Rubble of Kiraminar's Sanctum, a collection of elements for Dungeon World. The Subgothy of Storms, or Lightning in a Bottle, a journey scenario for 5e and other fantasy games. A Murder in Port Tam, which is a wild chase scenario for the Black Hack. Our newest miscellany, 3 dozen unnatural weather phenomena, 5 pieces of beautiful art, and a custom layout by Ollie Jeffrey. To get Codex Storm, just make a $4 or higher pledge to the Gauntlet Patreon in August. Thanks. It's Giving Me Life. Lowell, what's giving you life?
I don't know if it's giving me life, but I'm doing Gen Con prep and printing things out and panicking about that and stuff, running for Magpie. So that's sort of my top of mind thing. So yeah, we'll be at Gen Con and running stuff.
We will, yeah. How many games are you? I'm only running Velvet Glove. Like I'm otherwise just manning the front. How many games are you running, Lowell? I'm
running Masks, Urban Shadows, Varkith, and Anglekite.
Wow. Okay. Cool. Yeah.
6 sessions.
Wow. Yeah. I'm running, I think, just 1 or 2 sessions, and I'm just at the front, like kind of greeting people. But yeah, I think it'll be interesting. It'll be fun. Fraser, what's giving you life?
What's giving me life is a new design project. I didn't realize how often I design games until I went on the show, where I always talk about myself. But I'm designing a game called Never Knows Best. It's a game entirely trying to run FLCL or Fooly Cooly, which is a crazy anime that was one of the first to gained basically popular opinion and culture in the US when it was actually, I think, the first anime that was licensed in the US, and it went on Adult Swim, I think it's called. And I'm trying to make a PBTA game that is emulating that, and it's about middle school kids who fight their inner turmoil, which comes out of them, and they transform into robots in order to combat it. So it's interesting because the fiction is supposed to not make any sense. It is like supposed to be confusion and adolescence and growing up and puberty and all that kind of stuff. And I find RPG fiction generally leans towards gonzo, crazy, not making sense anyway. And the things that root it is character development and themes. So I'm trying to imprint that onto a PBTA game, and then we'll see how that goes. It's giving me life because I'm using a lot of tech, including some from Hearts of Wulin, actually, and Monsterhearts and masks to try to make this happen. And I don't know if it's going to sink or swim, but I'm very excited to see where it's going.
I'm looking forward to stealing from it so I can do a Revolutionary Girl Utna version of that. So
sweet.
Yeah, I've read the text that you have so far. I think it's really cool. I think it's pretty exciting, actually. I think it could be like the next big thing in PBTA, actually. I think Giving Me Life is the Gauntlet blog. 6 months after we funded it on the Patreon, the blog is finally here. It took us a while to get it going for reasons that are probably not worth going into right now. But in any case, it's done and it's launched, and I'm very happy. This is the kind of thing that like people probably don't care about, but like I care about it. And so like our traffic on the website is much higher ever since we launched the blog. We're getting just a different kind of like interaction with people on social media because of the blog posts already, even just a week in. And so, yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. I've got a few articles lined up and ready to go. Lowell's going to be bringing over Age of Ravens to the Gauntlet blog.
I'm building up my backlog so I can jump in with both feet bring that to the table.
Yeah, it's exciting. So, yeah, the Gauntlet blog is just going to be another great, awesome way to interact with the community and interact with the Gauntlet, and to finally create some sort of record, like an official sort of like, a record of our thoughts and writings, like kind of all in one place. So I'm pretty pumped.
Yeah, I think it's going to be amazing.
Yeah.
And listeners, that's our show. If you'd like to get in touch with us, we are on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. We have a G+ community. Just go to the community section of G+ and search for the Gauntlet. You will find us. We are on the World Wide Web at gauntlet-rpg.com. That's also where our blog is. And we are on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. Lowell, thanks so much.
Oh, thank you, Jason.
Fraser, thanks for coming on the show again.
Thank you.
And listeners, thanks for listening. Take care.